If things don't get better, he'll find a place of his own. He's my friend. I can't just say no to him, especially since he was the best man at our wedding. I understand, Becca said, sounding a bit stressed. Is it because of his past that you're worried? Tim asked. Not exactly, Becca replied. I shouldn't judge. I just feel unsure about it. We're both so busy. She paused, trying to find the right words. If it were someone else, it would be easier, but this felt more complicated. There was a complicated history that lingered in her mind. The night she met Tim was also the night she met Rob. Becca and her friend were at a bar when they started chatting with two guys who turned out to be Tim and Rob. Becca had jokingly talked with Rob that night. He was handsome and charming, and she felt an instant attraction. However, Rob chose to leave with her friend, leaving Becca shocked and disappointed. In the end, everything worked out well. Tim was thoughtful and made sure she got home safely without any pressure. In the following weeks, Becca and Tim went out several times and realized they had a lot in common. While Tim didn't have Rob's charm, he was smart and responsible, and he made her laugh. They fell in love and have been happily married for over 12 years. Becca hadn't realized how that night had stayed with her. She had always felt confident about her looks and seldom faced rejection, so being overlooked by Rob was new for her. Soon after that night, Rob moved away for work and they rarely saw him. He returned briefly to be Tim's best man at their wedding, but had mostly been out of their lives. That changed a few months ago when he moved back to town with his new wife, whom he had met just 3 months before. Once he returned, he and Tim reconnected, and they spent time together as couples. Becca wasn't very fond of Rob's new wife, Jane, but managed to handle it. She couldn't quite understand why she felt uneasy around Jane, even though she was friendly and lovely. Becca never felt like she was a good match for Rob, for reasons that were hard to explain. Then, 2 weeks ago, while out with friends at a pub, Becca unexpectedly ran into Rob. They chatted and both enjoyed the evening, and she noticed she responded positively to his friendly nature. They had shared light-hearted jokes all night until he leaned in and suggested they leave together. For reasons Becca couldn't fully understand, she agreed without thinking much about her husband or what might happen next. The guilt she felt in the days that followed was real, but it wasn't as heavy as she expected. She felt bad for being unfaithful, especially with Rob, who was Tim's best friend. Still, there was a strange comfort in their time together that was unlike anything she had felt before. When Rob reached out a week later asking to meet up in a hotel room that afternoon, she said yes. That meeting left her even more confused about her feelings. It brought out feelings she hadn't experienced before, making her question her understanding of intimacy. However, After that second meeting, Becca knew she couldn't betray Tim any longer. She didn't want to hurt her marriage or cause pain to her husband, with whom she had shared so much of her life. It felt wrong to put her temporary desires above their relationship. So when Rob texted again, suggesting another meeting, she said no. She told him it was wrong, recognizing the seriousness of what they had done. It was important that they never let this happen again, and that Tim never found out. To her surprise, Rob respected her decision and didn't try to change her mind. Becca thought it was strange that he didn't even attempt to persuade her to reconsider. She felt a hint of the same hurt she had felt years ago when he chose her friend over her. Rob hadn't contacted her for the last 2 weeks, honoring her request. Now, Tim was trying to convince her to let Rob stay with them, as his wife had found out about his unfaithfulness. Becca's mind raced with worry. Did Jane learn about her connection with Rob? Would she tell Tim everything? Or maybe Rob had been with someone else since she last saw him, and that was who he'd gotten in trouble with. That thought troubled her almost as much as the idea that she might be part of their breakup. How could Rob even think about staying with them after what he had done? How could he ask to stay with them when he knew he had broken his best friend's trust? Becca felt angry just thinking about it. So is it okay then? She heard Tim ask. Somehow, lost in her thoughts, she must have said yes without even realizing it. I guess, she replied, feeling this was a bad idea. Are you sure he wants to stay here? It seems strange that he would want to. Tim looked at her, puzzled. Why would it be strange? We're best friends. Who else would he ask? He said. Right, of course, she replied, gathering her thoughts. I just think it's strange he wouldn't just get a hotel. He might end up doing that later, but I think he's worried about money, especially if she doesn't take him back and they end up going through a difficult divorce. So it may not be for long anyway, he comforted her. Okay then, she sighed, trying to smile at her husband. I guess we can let him stay for a little while, but let's not let it go on too long, okay? I like having you all to myself, she said, cozying up to him. I promise, Tim said, wrapping his arms around her. And who knows, we may actually enjoy having him around for a bit. He's a lot of fun, and you two have always gotten along well. I've noticed how friendly you are when you both are having a good time, he teased. Ha ha, very funny, she replied, trying to sound lighthearted. That's not true. All right, if you say so, Tim laughed, giving her a gentle pat. Becca felt warmth as she leaned against him. Wow, someone is in a good mood, she said, looking up at him with a bright smile. Maybe you like the idea of others noticing me. Well, Tim grinned, maybe I like that others can't help but see my amazing wife. Or, Becca teased, maybe you like the thought of your wife being friendly with others. She raised an eyebrow, enjoying their playful back and forth. Is that what it is? She asked teasingly, her eyes full of fun. Do you enjoy thinking about me being charming with other people, Tim? Tim paused, gazing into her eyes. Becca felt a playful excitement in the air as he thought about her words. Suddenly, he lifted her into his arms, making her laugh out of surprise as they continued their light-hearted exchange. Tim and Becca sat together in the kitchen, enjoying the calm of the evening. He took her hand, holding it gently. Becca looked at him and noticed something different in his eyes, a sense of urgency. She tilted her head slightly, curious about his sudden change in mood. You seem different tonight, Becca said softly, her gaze searching his face. Tim's grip on her hand tightened for a moment, and his voice was low but clear. I just wanted to be close to you. They exchanged a deep look, the atmosphere around them thick with unspoken feelings. Tim leaned in and rested his forehead against hers, sharing a quiet moment that felt special without needing words. Becca felt a strong connection with him in that simple gesture, their bond rekindled in a way that was hard to describe. As the moment passed, Becca stood up and turned to look out the window, lost in her thoughts. Tim stood quietly behind her, his hand resting softly on her shoulder, reminding her of the special times they had shared together. The evening passed in a calm silence, their connection showing how strong they were as a couple. It hadn't taken more than a few minutes, but she smiled at the sight of his pleased face. Wow, she said quietly. That was something. Tim beamed and wrapped her in a warm hug. Sorry if I got a little too excited, he said. I just couldn't help it. Becca laughed lightly, feeling a wave of relief. So, she asked, still trying to catch her breath, what got you so worked up? Tim's hands rested gently on her back. Did you like that? He asked softly, his voice low. I did, Becca admitted quietly. But I'm just curious what made you feel that way. I've never seen you like this. Tim smiled, looking a bit shy. I'm not sure, to be honest, he said, looking down for a moment. Becca studied him closely, thinking carefully. Are you really unsure? Could it be that you were thinking about me being with other guys? She asked, playfully. Tim smiled sheepishly. Well, maybe I like the idea that other guys want you, even if it's just because they know you're with me, he admitted with a shy smile. Becca felt mixed emotions at his answer. Part of her was intrigued, but it also reminded her of her past actions. Hearing Tim express such confidence in their relationship made her feel a wave of guilt. Yes, I'm all yours, Becca whispered back, holding him tightly and trying to set aside her feelings. Early Saturday morning, Becca heard a knock at the front door, making her heart race. Tim had called Rob earlier that week to let him know he could stay as long as he needed to. Becca didn't want to think about it until Rob actually arrived. She watched from the kitchen window as Rob pulled up in his truck, looking around before heading up the driveway and out of her sight. She heard Tim welcome him, and a rush of guilt washed over her. Becca felt a knot in her stomach. She heard Tim invite Rob in and show him to the guest room. Being in the same house as Rob made her uneasy. It wasn't that she disliked him. It was the weight of her own choices that made her feel this way. Having him there would be a sharp reminder of her past. She focused on finishing the breakfast she started making for Tim. She couldn't eat. Her stomach was a mess, and she didn't feel hungry. Rob's voice echoed in the hallway as he talked with Tim about his stay. Becca squeezed her eyes shut and took a deep breath, gathering herself for what was to come. She knew she couldn't avoid him forever, especially since they would be living in the same house for a while. But that didn't make it any easier to see him. A wave of shame hit her as she thought about their past. She had hurt her husband in a way that still made her feel bad, and she wished she could change it. Becca took a deep breath and walked out of the kitchen, ready to face Rob. As she turned the corner, she saw him standing in the hallway looking as charming and strong as she remembered. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his dark eyes had a serious look. "Becca," he said calmly, "it's good to see you." She forced a smile and tried to keep her voice steady. "Hi, Rob. It's good to see you too." Rob smiled back, and Becca's heart raced a little. She reminded herself to breathe as he walked toward her. "I want to thank you and Tim for letting me stay here," he said warmly. "I really appreciate it." Becca nodded but couldn't find her voice. Rob's presence was hard to handle, and memories of their past came flooding back. She felt her cheeks grow warm, aware of her blush. Yeah, of course," she said, her voice shaky. She glanced at Tim, hoping he wouldn't notice her discomfort, but he just smiled at her, easing her worries. She wished things wouldn't stay this way in the coming days. "Sorry to hear about you, know," she said, looking down at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. "You and your wife." "Thanks," Rob replied, nodding. "It's been tough." Becca nodded in sympathy, unsure what else to say. She couldn't look at him directly. The guilt still bothered her. She felt Tim watching her but didn't dare meet his gaze. "Well, I'll let you guys get settled," she said quickly, turning around and going back to the kitchen. As she poured herself a glass of juice, she felt anxious. The first week of Rob's stay went better than Becca expected. They shared a few meals, talked small talk, but their busy work schedules kept them apart most of the time. On some evenings, when she and Tim relaxed on the sofa, Rob would join them for a drink. They would share light conversations while watching television. Becca sometimes found herself glancing his way to see if he might be looking at her, thinking about what they had shared. She wasn't sure if she was looking for signs of guilt or maybe hoping he remembered their bond. She found herself thinking about it more than she wanted to. But Rob never seemed to look her way. What was going on with him, she wondered. She really thought he would at least try to talk about it with her, to let her know he also felt uncertain, that it was a mistake. Or maybe she would joke with him when Tim wasn't around. After all, those times they shared felt important. The more she reflected, the more she realized those moments meant a lot to her. Surely he must have felt something too. By the end of the first week, she found it a bit frustrating that he seemed so casual about everything. It felt like he had quickly moved on. Becca tried to push these thoughts away. She should appreciate that he was behaving well in his best friend's house. If he wanted to connect, he respected her space in her home. That's how she decided she should feel. On Friday afternoon, Tim sent her a message from work. He told her that Rob would be taking them out for dinner that night, as a way to thank them. That evening, they went to a nice restaurant and enjoyed a couple of bottles of wine. Tim and Rob shared laughter and stories, many of which Becca had heard before. She tried to join in on the conversation now and then, but she felt a bit out of place. At one moment, she excused herself to the restroom and found herself looking at the mirror. Her hair fell over her shoulders, and her cheeks were rosy from the wine. She had chosen a pretty dress that made her feel good about herself. She thought she looked better than she had in a while. She adjusted her hair and smiled at her reflection, wondering if her dress was a bit bold. Never mind, she thought, and stepped out of the bathroom. As she exited, she saw Rob walking toward her with a friendly smile. The way he carried himself made her heart race again. She felt a strange excitement when they were together. As he approached, she felt butterflies in her stomach. "Hey, Becca, you look great," he said softly, his eyes shining with something she couldn't fully understand. She felt her cheeks warm at his compliment. "Oh, this old thing? Thanks, Rob." "You look good too," she said, trying to keep it light. Her heart raced a bit faster as she became aware of how close he stood. They stayed quiet for a few moments. "So," Becca finally said, breaking the silence, "have you heard from Jane?" She felt hesitant mentioning Rob's wife since it might remind him of a tough situation. "Not really," he replied. Becca watched him closely, trying to understand what he meant. Maybe she hoped this would lead to a discussion about their past. Had she played a part in Jane finding out? How had Jane learned the truth, and what had Rob told her? Maybe he would feel some regret about what had happened. She wasn't quite sure what she wanted to hear from him. When Becca noticed Rob looking her way, her heart started beating faster. She felt her cheeks get warm and hoped it wasn't too obvious. "Sorry for staring," Rob said quickly. "It's just that—" "Just what?" Becca asked, feeling a mix of shyness and excitement. "Just made me think of—" Rob paused, a small smile appearing on his face. "You know?" Becca's heart raced even more. "I don't know," she replied, trying to sound naive. She wanted him to mention their time together, to show he had enjoyed it. She knew it wasn't right, and it made her feel guilty to want him to say those things, especially since he was her husband's best friend. "You know," Rob said again, looking straight at her. "Just how you seemed when we were together." His words sent a thrill through Becca. She had been hoping for him to say something about their meeting. She had thought about it a lot, but hearing him say it directly felt different, more intense. "Oh," she whispered, her voice very quiet. She glanced around, wanting to make sure no one else could hear. "Rob, we shouldn't have. It was wrong, and I don't want Tim to find out." Rob studied her closely, and she wondered if her words sounded empty to him like they did to her. Finally, he smiled and shrugged slightly. "Okay," he said, leaning a bit closer. She felt a rush of nerves. Rob pulled back, gave her a playful smile, and walked toward the men's bathroom. Becca watched him go in, catching his glance one last time. She leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and took a few deep breaths to calm herself. Mixed feelings were swirling inside her. Becca opened her eyes, wanting to regain her focus. She adjusted her dress and made her way back to her table, trying to appear calm. When they got home, the effects of the night were clear. Tim walked into the living room, sank into his chair, and soon fell asleep. Meanwhile, Rob and Becca stood in the hallway, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Rob suggested they share one last drink before bed, and he went to the kitchen to pour whiskey for all three of them. Becca accepted her drink with a faint smile, her mind clouded from the evening. As they sat in the living room, Becca felt increasingly uneasy. She noticed Tim was already asleep, his snoring echoing in the room, leaving an uncomfortable silence between her and Rob. The atmosphere felt heavy, and Becca realized the night was heading into a tricky situation. She took a sip of her drink, trying to push aside the silence. Becca felt uneasy with Rob around and realized things were getting complicated. She looked at Tim, still asleep, and felt a twinge of guilt. It seemed best to end the evening and step away from the confusing feelings she shared with Rob. Becca got up and softly said she needed to call it a night. The tension lessened as she walked upstairs, leaving Rob to finish his drink. The room fell quiet, and the night's unease faded as the house settled down. As Becca sat quietly, she could sense the atmosphere change when Rob looked at her. She felt uncomfortable and her mind raced. Tim's soft snoring filled the air, unaware of the strange situation around them. Rob offered her a glass of whiskey, and their brief eye contact made it clear things were different. Becca quickly looked away to avoid the intensity of the moment. After a moment, Rob stood up and walked to the door without saying a word. Becca stayed seated, feeling confused about what had just happened. She sensed discomfort but tried to set those feelings aside. She stood up, adjusting her dress, and quietly went upstairs, wanting to sort through her emotions. Tim's gentle snores followed her, and she felt the need to escape the confusion of the evening. Once in her room, she took a deep breath to calm herself before heading to bed. The house was now silent, the earlier tension fading, but her unsettled feelings stayed. She felt a mix of vulnerability and frustration. Becca's thoughts swirled between anger and confusion, but there was also a strange excitement below the surface. Getting up from the sofa, Becca realized she would let Tim rest in the chair. As she walked down the hallway to their bedroom, she paused by the closed guest room door. Was Rob trying to play a game? Did he think she would want to spend time with him away from her husband? Did he see her as someone to keep secret? She reached for the doorknob, feeling the urge to confront him and stand up for herself, but she hesitated, unsure of how to handle her feelings. With a frustrated sigh, she turned away from the guest room door. She needed time alone to understand what had happened. Once in the master bedroom, she quietly closed the door behind her. Becca felt a wave of embarrassment and anger wash over her, and tears slipped down her cheeks as she grabbed a tissue from the bedside table. Wiping away her makeup, she tried to remove any sign of the woman who felt so lost and uncertain about her choices. As she looked at herself in the mirror, sadness filled her. She didn't recognize the person staring back, her eyes showing guilt and confusion. Becca had always been proud of being a loyal and caring wife. But now, in such a short time, that part of her felt like it was fading. Climbing into bed, she curled up under the blankets, unable to escape her thoughts about the night. Each memory stirred up a storm of emotions inside her. She closed her eyes, hoping to find peace in the quiet of her room. She knew she had to think about herself and what she wanted for the future. She allowed herself one last moment of strong emotion before returning to her life as a devoted wife. Just as she remembered a brief moment with Rob, a rush of feelings overwhelmed her. She breathed out slowly, feeling a mix of confusion wash over her. Lying there, her mind raced with thoughts about the excitement she had briefly felt. Eventually, she started to calm down, her breathing still uneven. In that quiet moment, she felt a conflict arise in her mind. She had crossed a line that she never meant to, and the realization made her uncomfortable. Even with feelings of regret, a strange energy lingered inside her, something she had never felt before. The next morning, Becca woke with a heavy feeling in her chest. She turned to see her husband sleeping peacefully beside her. She felt sorry for what had happened the night before and silently promised herself not to repeat it. However, memories of Rob lingered, making her uneasy. She thought back to moments that had sparked something in her. Just then, she heard some noise from the hallway and realized that Rob was likely awake. She looked back at Tim and considered whether to wake him. Facing Rob alone felt intimidating after the previous night. Noticing it was already 8:14 a.m., she decided to let Tim sleep. Determined not to feel trapped at home, she put on a white bathrobe and prepared for the day. As she made her way down the hallway, the smell of coffee filled the air. She found Rob at the kitchen table, casually looking at his phone while sipping his drink. Dressed simply in jeans and a t-shirt, he seemed relaxed and comfortable. He looked up and smiled kindly. "Morning, Becca. Sleep well?" She tried to make her tone light. "Like a baby. How about you?" He shrugged. "A little restless, but that's life." He gave her a playful wink before returning to his phone. Becca nodded, feeling a mix of nerves as she navigated this unexpected morning encounter. "That's nice," Rob said, raising an eyebrow at Becca with a look of curiosity. "Going to the gym on a Sunday morning?" Becca smiled and took a sip of her coffee. "I need to stay in shape." He nodded but kept looking at her, making her feel a bit uneasy. She shifted in her seat, trying to ease the tension in the room. "Well, I should get going," she said, standing up to leave, hoping to avoid more awkwardness. Rob stepped closer, his voice gentle yet serious. "We need to talk about last night." Becca's heart raced as she glanced toward their bedroom. "What about it?" she asked, trying to sound calm. He paused for a moment before answering. "Did it mean anything to you?" The question hung in the air, and Becca felt its weight. She shook her head slowly, speaking steadily. "We both got caught up in the moment, but it was a mistake." Rob looked at her a moment longer and then stepped back. "Yeah, I guess you're right." Becca nodded and quickly left, relieved to end the conversation before it could get any more awkward. She walked away, determined to move past the discomfort and focus on her day. Rob watched her leave with a knowing look. "You're not happy, Becca. I can see it. Marriage isn't always easy." A mix of frustration and discomfort washed over Becca. "You can't know how I feel," she replied, her voice uneasy. Rob stepped closer. "I'm just saying it wasn't surprising that we ended up together that night. You were looking for something, right?" Becca shook her head, trying to stay calm. "It was a mistake. It shouldn't have happened." He shrugged, unaffected. "Maybe. But you wanted it, Becca. You didn't hold back then, and you can't pretend it didn't mean anything." Trying to create distance, Becca stepped back. "I'm not doing this again," she said firmly, trying to take charge of the situation. Rob sighed and let the tension linger before finally moving back. "All right, if that's what you want." Becca took a slow breath, feeling relief as she turned to leave the room. The conversation had unsettled her, but she was focused on moving forward, leaving past mistakes behind. Rob leaned against the counter, the air still heavy with unspoken words. Becca adjusted her robe, trying to keep things normal. The silence grew louder between them. Just then, the bedroom door creaked open, and Tim's sleepy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Becca's heart raced as she stepped away from Rob, standing tall and pulling her robe tighter around her. "Hey, love," Tim said sleepily, rubbing his eyes as he walked into the kitchen. "Good morning, dear," Becca replied, trying to sound relaxed, while her mind raced to forget the awkwardness hanging in the air. Tim yawned and headed for the coffee maker, completely unaware of the unease between his wife and his best friend. Becca silently wished for the moment to pass, her feelings tangled with guilt and confusion. As Tim went about his morning routine, Becca stood quietly, keeping her distance from Rob and hoping the awkwardness would fade soon. Becca forced a smile, her thoughts racing. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her voice quivered slightly. Tim yawned and stretched. "Good, I think. Just had some strange dreams," he replied, still blind to the tension in the room. "Must be from all the wine," Becca said, glancing quickly at Rob before looking away. Her mind was still spinning, and she hoped her voice would stay calm. Rob stretched and stood up. "I didn't sleep very well either. I think I'll head back to bed for a bit," he said, giving Becca a friendly smile. "Enjoy your time at the gym. Just don't overdo it." With a small nod, he walked down the hallway. Becca's heart raced as she watched him go. Tim leaned in to give her a kiss, but she turned slightly, letting him kiss her on the cheek instead. "I need to get going," she said quickly, pulling her robe tighter. "Just need to change and head to the gym." Tim looked at her for a moment longer than usual, but Becca was too tired and frazzled to understand his expression. She turned and went to her room, needing a moment to gather herself before leaving the house. That evening, the three of them sat together watching a movie, the room quiet except for the sound of the TV. By the time the credits rolled, it was past 10 p.m. Becca stood up to clear the empty glasses. "I'm going to take a shower before bed," Tim said, giving her a quick hug before heading to the bathroom. Becca sighed, feeling relieved for the moment alone, but turned around to see Rob watching her with a grin. "What?" she asked, a bit defensive. "Nothing," Rob replied casually. "I just find it curious how you're acting like everything is normal." She scoffed and shook her head, trying to downplay his comment. "What do you want, Rob?" she muttered, unable to finish her thought. Her frustration was growing, but she knew she had to stay in control. Rob leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his gaze still on her. Becca looked away, trying hard to focus on anything but what was happening around her. She hoped the tension would go away soon. Becca felt confused, her thoughts racing as she stood with Rob, knowing they were in a tricky situation. She glanced nervously down the hallway, aware that Tim was close by. "I'm not sure," Becca said slowly. "Tim is right there," she added, feeling torn inside. Rob didn't say anything, but he kept looking at her. She hesitated, her mind spinning as she thought about what could happen next. Suddenly, she heard the bathroom door open and footsteps coming closer. Becca felt a rush of panic and tried to move quickly, not wanting Tim to find her in an awkward situation. Rob held onto her arm a little tighter, causing her heart to race. She tried again to pull away, hoping to avoid any trouble. "Hey, what's up?" Tim asked casually from the other side of the counter. From her spot, hidden from view, Becca's heart raced as she listened closely. "Not much, just having another drink before I head to bed," Rob replied smoothly. Becca held her breath, doing her best to stay unnoticed as the tension filled the room. "Where's Becca?" Tim asked Dot. She could hear the sound of a bottle being opened and realized Tim had decided to pour himself another drink. "Not sure. She may have gone to bed," Rob answered. Becca noticed Rob's hand brushing against her hair, and a feeling of discomfort washed over her. She couldn't believe he was still trying to push things, but she stayed quiet, uncertain about what to do. "So listen," Tim said. "I never asked, and it's fine if you don't want to say, but what happened with you and Jane? Did she really suspect something?" "Yeah, unfortunately," Rob sighed, taking a sip. "She didn't catch me or anything, but she thought something was off. I probably didn't handle things well when she asked me about it." "Wow, that's tough," Tim replied. The room went quiet for a moment as both men took a drink. "So how was it?" Tim asked lightly, trying to keep things cheerful. Rob chuckled. "It was fine, I guess. Nothing special." Becca felt frustrated. What did he mean by nothing special? Was he talking about her? Anger bubbled up inside her, but she stayed silent. "I mean, things were okay. She was a bit older than I'm used to, but I guess I've had better," Rob continued casually. She could hear Tim laugh. Becca's frustration grew. Older? She and Rob were almost the same age. She couldn't believe the way he spoke, especially with Tim there. Her anger intensified, but she held her tongue, not wanting to create a scene. "Yeah, sometimes things don't turn out how you think," Tim said with a laugh. "Yep," Rob agreed, taking another sip. "What about Becca?" Becca froze, thinking surely Tim wouldn't talk about her like that. She hoped he wouldn't get into any details. Becca always thought she was confident, but now she felt doubts creeping in. She started reflecting on the effort she had put into her marriage, feeling the urge to prove herself. As her husband Rob spoke to his friend Tim, Becca tried to ignore her frustration and focus on what she needed to do. She was determined to show her worth, even though their conversation hinted at a disrespect that only made her more determined. Her mind started to race as she focused on her actions, blocking out everything else. Feeling underestimated stirred something inside her, but instead of reacting, she chose to stay calm. There was a tense feeling in the room, but Becca kept quiet, concentrating on her pride and dignity. Despite the heavy atmosphere from Rob's comments, Becca attempted to stay composed. His careless words annoyed her, but she worked to keep her cool. She wanted to leave, yet her mind was busy, searching for the right way to speak up without making things worse. "Some people think they can do whatever they want," Rob said casually, aiming his words more at Tim. Tim laughed weakly, clearly uncomfortable. Becca felt her frustration grow as she stood up, her legs feeling shaky. She looked Rob in the eyes, her face showing her anger and disappointment. "You can't treat people like that," she said firmly, using the back of her hand to wipe her face, trying to shake off the feeling of embarrassment. "Especially not with my husband here." Rob just shrugged and gave her a dismissive glance, uninterested. "You'll see things my way eventually," he said, his smirk still on his face. Becca's heart raced as she stood her ground, furious at his behavior. She took a deep breath, holding back her feelings and refusing to show him how much his words had stung. Without saying anything more, she turned away, determined not to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She shot Rob a glare, her anger clear. "You think that's supportive?" she snapped, her voice trembling with frustration. "You nearly got us in trouble and you think it's fine?" Rob shrugged again, looking unconcerned. "Oh, come on, Becca, let's not pretend you didn't enjoy it." Becca stepped back, feeling furious but unsure how to reply. She clenched her fists, trying to stay calm. "You like pushing limits, don't you?" Rob said, his voice relaxed. "You've been bored for too long and now you're looking for something new." Becca's face turned red with anger, but before she could respond, Rob casually mentioned, "Anyway, I'm heading to bed. You should get some rest." Becca remained where she stood, feeling a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, and confusion. She needed some space to think. Without saying anything, she hurried down the hallway to her room and shut the door behind her. Tim was already in bed and turned, surprised by the noise. "Where were you?" he asked, looking at her. Becca didn't answer, moving quickly across the room. She looked at Tim with a serious expression but didn't explain anything. "Is everything okay?" Tim asked, noticing her energy. Becca remained silent as she sat on the edge of the bed, clearly deep in thought. Her mood felt different, but she didn't elaborate on what was troubling her. "Baby, what's going on?" Tim asked again, sensing something was off. "I'm just feeling a bit strange tonight," she replied simply, avoiding further details. Tim paused, unsure of what caused this sudden shift, but he didn't press her for more. The atmosphere was tense as Becca lay down beside him, trying to relax and ignore what was bothering her. She glanced at Tim, her thoughts racing, yet she kept quiet, hoping the moment would pass. She wanted him to know she was happy with their life together. But as she thought, frustration bubbled up inside. She shifted on the bed, unable to find comfort in the stillness of the room. "What are you doing?" Tim asked, sounding worried. Becca didn't answer right away. Her mind was wandering. She was trying to feel calm, but her thoughts kept slipping away. "That feels nice," Tim said, trying to draw her back in, his voice gentle. Becca continued her movements, but her mind was elsewhere. She tried to refocus, yet something felt off. Closing her eyes, she hoped to find peace, but confusion washed over her. Noticing her distance, Tim pulled her close and whispered sweet words. Becca let out a soft sigh and rested her head against Tim's chest. Time felt slow, but she stayed quiet, deep in her thoughts. "That was nice," Tim said softly, breathing a bit heavier. Becca remained quiet, keeping her thoughts to herself. Unease lingered in her mind, but she didn't express it. She knew it was not right to think too much about those feelings, yet they wouldn't go away. Becca felt torn, not only by what had happened, but by how she had allowed things to unfold. It was unsettling to realize she had lost some control. This was a new feeling for her, and she struggled to understand it. Finally, she turned over next to Tim, still catching her breath under the weight of her thoughts. Tim, feeling more calm, gently moved her hair aside and gave her a soft, caring kiss. It was a moment of warmth that felt special, filled with love. Yet even in this peaceful moment, she felt a little uneasy. "That was nice," Tim whispered softly. "But I think our roommate might have heard you." He chuckled lightly, trying to lighten the mood. Becca paused before answering. "Let him hear," she said, surprising herself with her confidence. Tim raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything else. He kissed her forehead and turned over to sleep. Becca lay there, her mind filled with confusion. She needed to take charge of her life, to start making choices that matched who she truly was. After what felt like a long time, her eyes grew heavy, and she finally drifted into a restless sleep. Her dreams were chaotic, filled with feelings of regret and confusion. She saw herself making choices that didn't seem like her, doing things that didn't fit with who she wanted to be. The intense images troubled her, mixing moments of feeling lost with bits of control slipping away. When she woke suddenly, her heart was racing, and her mind felt jumbled from the strange dreams. She took a deep breath and looked at her husband, who was still peacefully asleep next to her. Trying to calm herself, she lay back down and focused on clearing her mind of the unsettling thoughts. Over the next few days, Becca tried to keep her mind clear from lingering worries. She kept her distance from Rob, focusing on keeping things normal in their home. She was polite and friendly, but limited her interactions, hoping to avoid raising Tim's suspicions. The idea of letting anything develop with Rob was something she had firmly pushed away. Her marriage to Tim was too precious to put at risk. As the days went by, she started to feel more at ease again. Though she sometimes caught Rob looking at her, she made sure not to encourage it, reminding herself of the boundaries she needed to keep. One evening, she asked Tim how long Rob would be staying with them, hoping for a timeline. But Tim wasn't in a hurry to ask his friend to leave. "It hasn't been long, Becca," he said. "Let's give him a bit more time to figure things out." Becca nodded, deciding to respect her husband's wishes. Even though the situation was tough, she focused on supporting Tim and set aside her discomfort. In the midst of all this, Becca noticed something positive happening in her relationship with Tim. Their bond had grown stronger, and they were spending more quality time together. The connection they had rediscovered felt refreshing, and their relationship seemed to be better than it had been in a long time. She often found herself feeling more grateful for her moments with Tim, making an effort to rebuild what they had once lost. As Becca spent more time with her husband, she worked hard to stay committed to him, pushing away thoughts of anyone else. Even though she felt a bit guilty about her mixed feelings, she couldn't deny that it made her emotions stronger. When Saturday evening arrived, Becca was excited to leave the house. She and some friends were going to a bachelorette party. She didn't know the bride very well, but she was looking forward to enjoying some drinks and taking a break from the awkwardness at home. Coincidentally, Tim and Rob had plans that night too. Rob's co-worker was hosting a gathering to watch a UFC fight, and he invited Tim to join. At 7:15 p.m., Becca came out of their bedroom looking great. She wore a dark blue summer dress that was just above her knees, with a nice neckline that added to her charm. It fit her well, and both Tim and Rob admired her as she walked into the room. She wore pretty heels, and her blonde hair cascaded down her back in loose waves, making her look radiant. As she entered the living room, Tim couldn't help but gaze at her. "Wow, Becca, you look amazing," he said, his admiration obvious. Becca felt her cheeks warm up from the compliment, stirring excitement in her stomach. "Thanks, hon," she replied with a cheerful spin. Rob couldn't take his eyes off her either. He got up from the couch, clearly impressed. "Yeah, you look really great," he said, catching Tim's eye for his reaction. Tim nodded, still enchanted by how beautiful his wife looked. Becca took a deep breath, feeling a mix of excitement and confidence. She walked over to Tim and Rob, aware of their gaze. Adjusting the straps of her dress made her feel a little more thrilled. "Well, I should get going," she said. "The girls are waiting for me." Tim nodded, still admiring her. He gently wrapped his arms around her waist for a moment before stepping back with a smile. "I can't wait to see you when you get home," he said playfully. Becca felt a warm glow from his words. I'm looking forward to it," she replied with a smile, whispering something nice as she moved towards the door. She felt their eyes on her, enjoying the attention as she walked away. It wasn't often she dressed up and went out, and having Tim and Rob admire her boosted her confidence. As she opened the door, she glanced back over her shoulder. "You boys have fun tonight," she said, stepping out into the cool evening air. Becca's night out with her friends was just what she needed. She had a few drinks, danced, and laughed, feeling lighter and happier than she had in weeks. She even joked with a couple of guys at the party, her mind drifting to what she might do with Tim when she got home. Just before 11 p.m., she took a moment to send him a text. "Hi, love," she wrote. "Hope you're having fun. So many guys are chatting with me. Must be the dress," she playfully added, hoping for a fun reply from her husband. After putting her phone in her bag, she went to the bathroom. As she finished drying her hands, her phone buzzed, letting her know she had a message. She took it out and saw a message from Tim. "Bad girl," he wrote. "Can't wait to see you later." Becca stared at her phone for a moment before replying. She could tell Tim had been drinking from the message he sent. This made her feel a bit disappointed. While she was happy he was enjoying himself, she worried he might have had a little too much to drink. With a sigh, she put her phone away and looked in the mirror to tidy up her lipstick. Becca smiled at herself, feeling good about how she looked. She reminded herself that she could still have a good time. With that in mind, she headed back to the party, ready to enjoy the rest of the night. As she danced with her friends, her phone buzzed again. She took it out and read Tim's new text. "Oops, sorry. Having fun. I won some money. What are you wearing?" Becca winced and rolled her eyes. "Better take it easy on the drinks, love. Remember we plan to have some fun later," she replied, adding a couple of playful emojis. She put her phone back in her bag and returned her focus to her friends. Still, she couldn't shake her feeling of disappointment. She had been looking forward to a cozy night with Tim, but it seemed less likely now. Pushing those thoughts aside, she focused on having a good time with her friends, which was exactly her plan. She drank, danced, and laughed, enjoying the friendly attention from some guys at the bar. She felt a little playful, but loved the excitement of it all. By the time she and her friends got into the Uber, she was smiling, filled with the night's energy. As they drove home, they laughed and shared stories about their night and the people they met. However, talking about their fun only reminded her of her growing frustration. She didn't want to text Tim again for fear of feeling let down, but she hoped he would calm down and be present for her tonight. She didn't expect much, but she needed some way to connect with him. When they got home, she fumbled with the key in the front door, trying not to make too much noise, realizing she had enjoyed a bit too much to drink herself. Thinking Tim and Rob were still out, Becca decided to head to her bedroom to relax. Given Tim's earlier messages, she doubted he'd be in the mood when he finally got home. As she walked through the living room, she saw the light on in the guest room where Rob was staying. She didn't expect them to be back yet, so she opened her own bedroom door to check for Tim. The room was dark, but the loud snoring from the bed made it clear that Tim was fast asleep. His clothes were scattered on the floor, and a half-empty bottle was on the nightstand. Becca sighed and quietly shut her bedroom door. So much for any plans tonight, she thought. Heading to the bathroom, she turned on the light and looked in the mirror. Her makeup was smudged and her hair was a bit messy, but she found it gave her a unique charm. Frustrated about having to go to bed without much to do, she frowned at her reflection. Deciding to get a glass of water to avoid a headache tomorrow, she turned back to her bedroom. When she opened her bedroom door, she noticed the guest room door was slightly open, a soft light spilling into the hallway. After pausing for a moment, she went to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter, sipping it slowly. Her mind drifted back to the party and the fun she had. A noise from down the hallway made her freeze, her heart racing. She picked up her glass and tiptoed toward her bedroom. Stopping at her door, she listened carefully and heard Tim's loud snores from inside. She glanced at the guest room door, still ajar, and thought she could hear some movement inside. Becca's heart raced as she stood there, her mind full of mixed feelings. She had promised herself she wouldn't let this happen again, yet she found her feet moving closer to the door. The quiet of the night surrounded her, and she paused for a moment. Her thoughts urged her to turn back, to go to her room, but she felt drawn toward the guest room. She stepped quietly inside, the moonlight creating soft shadows. Rob was lying peacefully in bed, unaware of her arrival. Becca's heartbeat sped up as she stood there, wrestling with her feelings. Rob stirred as he sensed her presence. His eyes slowly opened, and a gentle smile appeared when he saw her. "Hey," he said softly, barely above a whisper. Becca's breath caught. "Hi," she replied quietly, feeling the significance of the moment. "What are you doing here?" Rob asked, his voice calm and understanding. Becca hesitated, not sure how to reply. "I don't know," she said after a moment, her voice soft. For a brief second, they looked at each other, the air thick with unspoken feelings. Becca felt unsure but decided to stay, her inner conflict still unresolved. Becca's heart raced as emotions flowed through her. Rob's hand on hers made her feel something special, and she let out a small sigh. They shared a quiet moment, and everything around them faded away as they gazed into each other's eyes, the air full of unsaid feelings. Rob held her close, his presence giving her comfort in a way that words couldn't capture. The silence between them felt powerful, as if their bond expressed so much without speaking. For a moment, Becca thought about past times that hadn't felt quite like this. But now everything seemed different, more genuine. This closeness was about understanding each other, not just the physical. They stayed like this for what felt like a long time, enjoying the warmth of each other's company, feeling the strength of their connection in a calm, unhurried silence. Suddenly, Becca felt a change in her feelings and gently pushed Rob onto his back. She wanted to take charge, to guide what happened next, and for once, she felt strong in her choices. A determination filled her as she settled over him, her mind racing with her decisions. Rob looked at her with interest, but Becca stayed focused, knowing she was in control. She moved purposefully, feeling the moment build as she concentrated on her own actions. For the first time, she felt like she was leading the way. Her confidence grew as she took charge, aware that she was making her own choices. It was about her, reclaiming her own sense of strength. The moment passed with a silent understanding, a feeling of fulfillment without needing words. Becca felt steady, knowing she had finally taken control, leaving behind any doubts she once had. As she stood next to the door, Becca was filled with emotions, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. The intensity left her breathless, and she leaned against the door for support, feeling weak from it all. She glanced back at Rob, who was resting and watching her closely. Without saying much, Becca quietly collected herself and stepped out of the room, closing the door behind her. The air outside was cooler, and she took a moment to gather her thoughts, trying to push away the guilt that was creeping in. Her thoughts were all over the place, but Becca reminded herself it was just a brief moment of weakness, a response to unfulfilled needs. As she walked down the hallway, Becca entered her bedroom and saw Tim lying on his side. He had stopped snoring, and for a moment she just watched him. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the mixed feelings inside her. But he had decided to drink too much and fall asleep, leaving her longing for the closeness she had hoped for. Becca let her clothes fall to the floor and climbed into bed next to her husband. Tim stirred but didn't wake up. She lay there for a few minutes, justifying her actions while pushing away feelings of guilt. She had wanted closeness, and she had gone after it. It was that simple. When the morning sun filled the room, Becca woke up still in her pajamas. Memories of her visit to Rob's room rushed back, and she felt guilt start to surface. She quickly got out of bed and went to the bathroom. Splashing water on her face, she tried to wash away the thoughts of the night before. Looking in the mirror, she reflected on the confidence she had felt, how she had taken charge and done what she felt she needed to do. Becca put on her robe, trying to shake off these thoughts. She headed to the kitchen to make breakfast for herself and Tim. As she passed the guest room, her heart began to race. While cooking, she thought she heard sounds from one of the bedrooms, hoping it was Tim. Finally, a door opened and heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. She turned to see him walking into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. She couldn't bring herself to look directly at him. Tim seemed to notice her silence and her reluctance to make eye contact. "Is everything okay?" Becca managed a smile. "Yes, everything's fine." Tim grunted, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat down at the table. Becca continued cooking breakfast in silence, with her mind racing. When she placed a plate in front of him, Rob walked into the kitchen, casually dressed and with messy hair. Becca's heart skipped a beat at the sight of him. She quickly turned away and poured herself a cup of coffee. "Morning," Rob said, his voice low and rough. He walked over to the coffee pot, poured himself a cup, and sat down across from Tim. The two men sat quietly for a few minutes, sipping their coffee and slowly starting their breakfast. Becca realized that it was more than just guilt that was troubling her. She was upset with Tim. He had promised her connection the night before, and after she had looked forward to it all night, he had instead chosen to drink and sleep. If only he had been awake when she got home, even a little bit to comfort her. She wouldn't have ended up with Rob, she thought to herself. Finally, Tim looked up at Becca. "So, how was your night?" he asked, holding his coffee cup. Becca paused for a moment before answering. "It was fine," she replied, her voice a bit tight. "How was yours?" "It was good, I think," Tim said, "though I think I fell asleep before the main part. I might have had too much to drink." He chuckled nervously. "You did, my friend," Rob said, smiling at Tim. Becca leaned against the counter, fiddling with her coffee cup. I thought you would stay up for me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm really sorry," Tim responded. "I didn't mean to drink so much. I really looked forward to seeing you when you got home." "It's okay," Becca said, forcing a smile. "I was quite tired by the time I got to bed anyway." She heard Rob's quiet chuckle from across the table, but avoided looking his way. "Someone, on the other hand," Tim said, looking at Rob, "sounded like they had a fun night." Rob froze, his spoonful of scrambled eggs almost falling from his mouth. He looked at Tim with a blush creeping onto his cheeks. He stammered before quickly eating. "What do you mean?" Becca's heart raced as she glanced between Tim and Rob, then back to her husband. "Did you invite someone over after I went to bed last night?" Tim asked playfully. "I could hear you from my room. It sounded like you were having a lively chat," Tim said, a smile on his face. Rob's face turned bright red as he focused on his plate, avoiding eye contact. Becca held her breath, trying to understand Tim's words. "Tim, Becca began, her voice shaky. "It's okay," Tim cut in. Rob's an adult. He can handle a little joking. He laughed, taking another sip of his coffee. So who was it? He pressed. Anyone we know? Rob slowly finished his bite before looking at Tim, then Becca, and back to his food. Nah, just someone I was chatting with last week, he said with a shrug. You should have heard them. Tim grinned at Becca. It sounded like you two were having a good time. Becca's eyes widened in surprise, and her cheeks burned red. She looked at Rob, who was still avoiding their gazes, his face even redder than hers. It was before you got home, but it was loud enough to wake me, even though I was tired. Tim continued to tease. He stood up and took his dishes to the sink to rinse them off. Rob looked up at Becca and shrugged, a hint of a smile on his face. Becca felt warmth rush through her. She looked over at Tim by the sink, who seemed unaware of what really had happened. Well, I'm glad you had fun, Tim said, drying his hands with a towel from the counter. Is she still here or has she left? He joked. She came and went, Rob replied with a grin, enjoying his friend's cluelessness about him and Becca's secret. So how was she? Tim asked. Tim, Becca said sharply, don't be rude. She was okay, man. I think it had been a while for her. She seemed really into it. Rob smirked. Becca shot him a disapproving look, her face flushed. She couldn't believe he was bragging about this, especially with Tim so unaware. A mix of anger, disgust, and guilt bubbled inside her. How could Rob be so thoughtless? It was one thing to be with her husband's best friend, but joking about it while Tim didn't know was worse. Tim's laughter broke her thoughts. Dude, you must be something else. She was making sounds I've never heard, Tim joked. Becca snapped and turned to Tim quickly. Are you serious? She exclaimed, her face burning. You passed out on me last night and now you're making a joke about this? Really? Tim and Rob looked at her, surprised by her outburst. Becca, I was just joking, Tim said, touching her shoulder. She pulled away. Just joking? She asked, glaring. You were being thoughtless. If you hadn't had too much to drink, you might have paid better attention last night. Her anger was boiling, fueled by Tim's insensitivity and Rob's bragging. It wasn't untrue, but it made her feel belittled. Or maybe, she stammered, her anger peaking, maybe you wouldn't even recognize those sounds. Maybe you wouldn't understand how to really connect. She stood there, glaring at Tim. She saw shock and hurt on his face and realized she had gone too far. Tears filled her eyes as she turned and hurried down the hallway, slamming the bedroom door behind her. She curled up on the bed, trying to calm down. She knew her words had hurt, and she felt immediate regret. The mix of emotions inside her had exploded, and she had taken it out on Tim. She had been the one to betray him, yet somehow twisted it to make him seem at fault. The depth of her experience with Rob added to her struggle. Becca felt deep disappointment in Tim, which only added to her guilt. She wanted to run away from her feelings, unsure of how to move forward. The bedroom door opened quietly, and Tim came in, sitting beside her on the bed. Babe, Tim said softly, I know you're upset, and I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have said those things. It was wrong of me. Becca didn't say anything, feeling too ashamed to respond. Tim gently touched her arm. I don't know. Maybe I was feeling unsure, but that's my fault. I love you, and I know we're good together. Becca looked up at him and saw worry in his eyes. It made her feel worse, but she couldn't find the words. She felt bad knowing she had hurt him. The room was quiet for a long moment, and the tension was thick. Becca, is there something else bothering you? Tim asked, his voice uncertain. Becca felt sad hearing his tone. She couldn't tell him everything, so she tried to comfort him. No, Tim. I just love you, she whispered. Tim nodded, but doubt lingered in his eyes. I love you too, he replied slowly. But I want to understand. I thought we always told each other the truth. Becca felt the weight of his words, but she couldn't share everything. So she lied a little, trying to make things better. I'm just feeling a bit off today. I shouldn't have said what I did. I really appreciate us. Tim smiled a little, but the air still felt delicate between them. He gently ran his hand along her shoulder, checking if she was still upset. Becca didn't know how to answer, but she didn't want to hurt him more. She gave a small, forced smile, hoping it would help. Becca wondered if she would ever understand men. How one moment they could be arguing, causing deep feelings, and in the blink of an eye they seemed fine. As she shifted, her robe slipped a little, catching Tim's attention. Becca felt a surge of emotions as he watched her. "Becca," Tim said with urgency as he leaned closer. He moved closer and they shared a tender kiss. Becca felt warmth between them, their connection growing as they held each other tightly. Tim shifted a bit, trying to settle the tension while staying close. Becca felt more aware of him, sensing a blend of nerves and excitement. As they continued, thoughts raced in Becca's mind. She remembered her earlier outburst and how it had hurt Tim. Those memories weighed her down, making it hard to stay in the moment. "What am I doing?" she thought, trying to set her doubts aside. She wanted to feel happy in her life and embrace the love she shared with Tim without the confusing feelings creeping in. Becca squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, trying to sort through her thoughts. But they stayed close, reminding her of how her life had changed since Tim's best friend had come to stay with them. She wished for a return to simpler times, when her feelings weren't tangled in confusion and misunderstandings. The air felt heavy, and Becca could sense the tension. Tim's breath was quick above her, and she felt the weight of their situation pressing down on her, just like her own feelings of uncertainty. She hoped for some clarity amid the chaos. Becca struggled to concentrate, her mind wandering as Tim continued talking. She glanced at the door and felt a jolt when she saw Rob standing in the hallway watching. It made her uncomfortable, and she suddenly felt out of place. Her heart raced, feeling embarrassed for Tim, who seemed oblivious to the distraction. Becca wrapped her arms around him, trying to seem engaged. But her thoughts were far away, troubled by the situation. Tim, unaware of her distraction, poured his focus into the moment, his face showing deep concentration. Becca sensed that he was nearing the end of whatever was happening, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in her thoughts. She tried to pay attention, knowing it wasn't fair to Tim. Normally, their time together was a joy, but this moment felt different. She looked up at him and managed a smile, hoping it would lighten the mood even if it didn't feel real. As Tim began to breathe heavier, Becca wanted to connect, even though her mind was still occupied with worry. She felt him relax next to her, his breathing becoming more even as he settled down beside her. The room was filled with the soft sounds of their shared breath, but Becca's mind was drifting, troubled by things left unspoken. Becca wanted to pull away, to shout, but instead she held him close, wanting to find comfort in their closeness. She glanced toward the doorway, relieved to see that Rob was gone. She hugged Tim tighter, holding back tears and feeling disappointed with herself. "That was nice," Tim said, rolling over. Becca looked at him and forced a smile. "Yes, it was," she replied, reaching out to gently touch his face. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing lightly. "That really didn't help my headache," Tim joked, rubbing his forehead. "Well, that will teach you, won't it?" Becca teased, lightly playing with his shirt. "How about I grab you some medicine and a glass of water?" she asked as she got up from the bed. She walked to the bedroom door but stopped before leaving. She looked back at Tim, watching him for a few moments. "Tim," she said softly. Tim opened his eyes and turned to her. "Yeah, babe?" he replied, his voice still tired. Becca hesitated, her hand resting on the doorknob. She took a deep breath before she spoke. "I want you to know that I love you. I'm sorry for everything." Tears filled her eyes, and she tried to wipe them away. Tim looked at her with a confused look. "I know, dear," he said softly. "It's okay. I love you too." Becca nodded and left the room, gently closing the door behind her. Leaning against it, she closed her eyes and took slow, deep breaths to calm down. Finally, she opened her eyes and quietly walked down the hallway. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe to Infidelity Plus to stay updated with more captivating tales of infidelity and payback. Turn on notifications so you're the first to see our latest content.